All right, so we're in Photoshop now, officially in this class, and we'll be using Photoshop for the rest of the semester. So get used to it, and I would like you to avoid using Lightroom. If you have Lightroom experience, that's great. You can certainly use Lightroom in your own personal projects, but I am going to strongly encourage that you use Photoshop this semester. You'll be turning in PSD files, which are Photoshop files. And really, it's almost exactly the same as Lightroom, just a little bit more powerful in certain ways. Lightroom is still really useful, especially whenever you're on the go. They have great apps, and there's great mobile versions. But please keep in Photoshop. So I'm going to start by pulling over just a JPEG image. Okay, so I've taken this on my Olympus camera, and this is just a JPEG file. And whenever I drop it into Photoshop, or if I went File, Open, same thing. It's just going to open, by default in Photoshop. Sorry, I accidentally just cropped it. It's just going to open up in this sort of normal way. If you've ever used Photoshop before, you have your image here, and you can edit it and play around with it. So that's how a JPEG opens. Let's close out of this file. Now I'm going to show you how a RAW file opens. So this is an ORF file, which is the Olympus RAW format. There's NEFs, which is probably what most of you are shooting, which is Nikon RAW format. There's also like DNGs, and there's a ton of different formats. So let's pull in this ORF. And you'll notice it's going to open up Camera Raw. There's some settings here. It's going to ask the new ACR default, or the vertical film strip and single panels. I actually really prefer this. This is the old form, and I dig it. So I'm just going to say OK on that, and it's going to open up. And there's going to be a bunch of stuff. Say get started, you're fine. So what's happened here is we still have Photoshop open in the background, and Camera Raw, which is kind of like an element of Photoshop, is open on top. So our file is not actually open in Photoshop yet. It's in Camera Raw. And this is where we get to edit and play with the file. So here's what we're going to do. The very first thing is whenever I start working with any image is you want to make sure you turn off things like night shift. Go ahead and turn off night shift on your computer. Turn up your brightness to max and be in a well-lit room, not like a purely dark room. And again, you really want to have night shift or any other sort of color editing off. If you're on Windows, that's called night light. You might have something like Flux installed. Turn that off. It's just going to make your image red because it's trying to help your eyes. So the other reason that I don't recommend editing images at night is because it's quite bad for your eyes. So we have our image here in Camera Raw, and basically if we opened up a series of images, they would open up on the side. We can rate them and review them. We can do a bunch of different things. We can see some stats. So this was taken on an EPL8, which is like a little tiny camera. That's great for portable mirrorless shooting. And we have this picture of my mother-in-law's cat on top of a bag. And black cats are very hard to shoot for obvious reasons because you have to really crank the ISO to get them to come out with any sort of features. So on the right-hand side, we have a ton of different options, a bunch of different editing options. And these editing options have different tabs. For example, there's like this color mixer tab, which in the old version, they were actual separate tabs. So if you're using an older version of Photoshop, you'll see them. There's little tabs up here, but there's curves, there's details, there's things like that. We can also crop and rotate the image in here if we want to straighten it out or change anything. I don't actually recommend cropping in Camera Raw. I'll talk about why a little bit later. These things like spot removal and adjustment brushes and so on and so forth are really not your friend in Camera Raw. I would do those in Photoshop, and again, I'll show you how to do that. But the key thing is just to change these base settings. Here I'm on the edit mode to get a good overall image and play with the histogram up here, as well as just making sure that you're not being destructive in any way. So whenever I'm finished, I can say done or I can say open. And whenever I say open, that is how you then eventually open it directly in Photoshop, where we have the layers panel, and here's my image. So what's really cool about this is that ORF file, so if I go back and look, now has an accompanying XMP file. So raw files are just like a collection of data. I mean, technically all images are just collections of data, but ORF or raw files or NEF files have a ton of extra data with them. What's really cool about them is whenever you make edits in Camera Raw, it's saved to an XMP document. So this is just a little text file that tells the computer how to reinterpret this image, how to modify this image. So you're never actually changing the original picture that you took, you're just making some modifications to it that are read by the computer. So that's really cool because if I move just this image to another computer, I'll have a perfect copy of that same image I took, however many years ago, whereas this XMP file can be updated, today, for example, and will change what the image looks like. So if you are transferring your ORF files or your NEF files from one computer to another, and you want your raw adjustments, the adjustments you made in Camera Raw in Photoshop, you need to include this XMP file. So these little guys are a pair now, and they need to move together. So we're going to pause here, and I'm going to talk about some adjustments in Camera Raw and working with the histogram.